Hello everyone. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is right now. That's how YouTube keeps sending you more chilling stories like this. And now, let the night begin with Story 1. The man who rode past his stop. The train doors hissed shut behind me, and I felt that familiar relief of making it onto the last car before they closed. But as I looked around for a seat, I saw him sitting there in the corner. The same gray coat, the same blank stare, and I realized with growing horror that he'd been riding this train for 6 hours straight. When I finally worked up the courage to ask him why, he turned to me with the most grateful smile I'd ever seen and whispered, "Thank you for noticing." Let me back up and explain how I got to that moment, because it started so innocently. I'm a bartender at a place called Murphy's in downtown Portland, and my shifts usually run until about 1:30 a.m. The last train out to my neighborhood leaves at 2:15, which gives me just enough time to clean up, count the register, and jog the 3 blocks to the station. It's a routine I've followed for almost 2 years now, and I'd gotten comfortable with the predictability of it all. The blue line at that hour is mostly empty except for the occasional night shift worker heading home or someone who'd stayed out too late and missed the earlier trains. You get used to seeing the same faces: the security guard from the hospital, the cleaning lady from the office buildings, a few service industry folks like myself. It becomes this weird little community of insomniacs and late workers, all of us. Too tired to make conversation, but sharing this unspoken understanding of what it means to be awake when the rest of the city is sleeping. That's why I noticed the man in the gray coat right away. He didn't fit the usual pattern. He got on at the 3rd stop, Morrison Street, carrying a worn leather briefcase and wearing a coat that looked expensive but outdated, like something from the 1980s. What struck me initially wasn't his appearance, it was his stillness. While the rest of us swayed with the train's movement, checked our phones, or dozed against the windows, he sat perfectly upright, hands folded over the briefcase in his lap, staring at some fixed point in the distance. I didn't think much of it at first. People process exhaustion differently, and maybe he was just one of those travelers who stayed alert until he reached his destination. But as we pulled into each subsequent stop, he never moved, never checked his phone or looked toward the doors, never showed any sign of recognition when we reached areas where someone dressed like him might logically live. By the time we hit the end of the line in Hillsborough, I was the only other passenger left in the car. I expected him to get off. Everyone gets off at Hillsborough because that's where the line terminates. The train sits there for about 10 minutes while the driver switches ends and prepares for the return journey downtown. But when the doors opened, the man in the gray coat remained seated. I almost said something then, almost asked if he was okay or if he needed directions somewhere. But something about his absolute stillness held me back. There was an intensity to his focus that felt deliberate, like disturbing him might be a mistake. The train started its return journey, and I settled back into my seat, figuring he'd get off at his actual stop on the way back downtown. Maybe he'd been deep in thought and missed his exit. It happens to all of us sometimes. But as we retraced the route, Hillsborough to Beaverton to Portland, hitting every stop I'd just watched him ignore, he never moved, not even when we reached Morrison Street, where he'd originally boarded. When we arrived back downtown at the end of the return trip, I was faced with a choice. My apartment was a 12-minute walk from the station, and I was exhausted from a busy Friday night at the bar. The logical thing would have been to get off, go home, and forget about the strange passenger. But something nagged at me. Maybe it was professional instincts from years of bartending. You develop a sense for when someone's not okay, when they're too deep in their own head to make good decisions for themselves. So I stayed on the train. The driver switched ends again, and we began another journey out to Hillsborough. This time, I positioned myself where I could watch the man more closely without being obvious about it. What I saw unsettled me more than his initial stillness had. He wasn't staring at nothing, as I'd initially thought. His eyes moved with perfect precision, tracking something outside the windows that I couldn't see. At certain stops, his grip on the briefcase would tighten almost imperceptibly. At others, he'd tilt his head slightly, as if listening for something specific. There was a pattern to his reactions, but I couldn't decipher it. More disturbing was his breathing. It was too controlled, too measured, like someone concentrating very hard on maintaining a specific rhythm. And occasionally his lips would move almost silently, forming words I couldn't hear over the train's noise. By 4 a.m., we'd completed 3 full round trips. The morning cleaning crew had started their shifts, and I saw a few early commuters beginning to board for the first runs of the day. Normal people heading to normal jobs, completely unaware that one of their fellow passengers had been riding the same route for hours without any apparent destination or purpose. I was starting to feel genuinely unsettled. This was beyond someone missing their stop or being lost in thought. This was something else entirely, and the rational part of my brain was telling me to get off the train and go home. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if I left, I'd be abandoning someone who needed help, even if I couldn't understand what kind of help that might be. During the 4th trip, something changed. As we pulled away from one of the suburban stops, the man turned his head slightly and looked directly at me. Not the vague, unfocused gaze of someone suddenly aware they're not alone. This was deliberate recognition. He'd known I was there all along. His expression wasn't threatening, but it wasn't entirely friendly either. It was evaluative, like he was trying to determine something important about me based on the fact that I'd chosen to stay on the train with him through multiple loops of the route. I should have gotten off right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to move to a different car, or better yet, get off at the next stop and call it a night. But there was something in his eyes, not menace exactly, but a kind of desperate hope that kept me frozen in my seat. It was during the 5th loop, somewhere around 6 a.m., that I finally worked up the courage to speak to him. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice low and non-confrontational. "Are you okay?" He turned to face me fully for the first time, and I saw that his eyes were bloodshot with exhaustion. But his smile, when it came, was radiant with genuine gratitude. "Thank you for noticing," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. For someone to see the pattern, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. He shifted the briefcase to his other hand, and I caught a glimpse of what looked like tally marks scratched into the leather surface. Hundreds of them, grouped in sets of 5. "I got on this train 7 months ago," he said. "I was heading home from work just like you probably were tonight. But when I tried to get off at my stop, the doors wouldn't open for me. Not malfunction, they opened for everyone else." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. He gestured toward the windows. The question hit me like a physical blow. In all the hours I'd been riding with him, through all those loops of the route, I'd never actually attempted to leave the train. I'd told myself I was staying to help him, to figure out what was wrong. But now I couldn't remember making a conscious decision to remain seated as we'd passed through downtown again and again. "The pattern chooses us," he continued, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality. "People who notice things others don't. People who pay attention when they should look away." I tried to stand up, to move toward the doors, but my legs wouldn't respond. It wasn't paralysis exactly, more like the feeling of being caught between sleep and waking, aware but unable to act. "I don't understand," I managed to say. He reached into his coat and pulled out what looked like a train schedule, but the times and dates were all wrong, spanning decades. "Someone has to maintain the route. Someone has to keep track of the stops that don't exist on the official maps anymore. The stations they built over, the platforms they sealed off, The train was slowing for another stop, but I didn't recognize the platform outside the windows. The tiles were old, cracked, covered in grime that looked like it had been accumulating for generations. The name on the sign was partially obscured, but I could make out mill and brook before the letters dissolved into rust stains. "This is where I get off," he said, standing for the first time in hours. His joints creaked audibly like someone much older than he appeared. The doors opened with their familiar hiss, but the sound was different somehow, deeper, more final. He walked toward the exit, then paused and turned back to me. "The briefcase is under your seat now," he said. "Everything you need to know is inside. The tally marks are for the loops you'll want to keep count, and don't worry about food or sleep." He stepped onto the platform and the doors closed behind him. I watched through the window as he walked away into darkness that seemed to swallow him completely. When I looked down, there was indeed a briefcase at my feet, identical to the one he'd been carrying. Inside, I found the schedule he'd shown me, along with notebooks filled with observations in dozens of different handwritings. Names and dates going back to the 1950s, maps of stations that had never been built or had been built and then removed from official records, and a letter written in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of writing it. "If you're reading this, you've been chosen to maintain the route. Don't try to fight it. Don't try to get off before your replacement arrives. The train has to keep running and someone has to make sure it hits all the stops, even the ones that don't exist anymore. Especially those ones. Count the loops, take notes, wait for someone else to notice. They will, eventually." That was 6 months ago. I've been riding the Blue Line ever since, watching the stops roll by, keeping track of the passengers who board at stations that aren't on any map. I've filled 3 notebooks with observations, and the tally marks on the briefcase now number in the thousands. I know this sounds impossible. I know you're thinking this is the story of someone who had a breakdown, who lost touch with reality and constructed an elaborate delusion to explain away a mental health crisis. I thought the same thing for the first few weeks. But then I started paying attention to the other passengers, the ones who get on at Millbrook Street, which was demolished in 1987, the ones who exit at Central Station, which was never built, the cleaning woman who boards every night at 3:17 a.m. at a platform that exists only between Morrison and Yamhill, in a space too narrow for a station. They're all maintaining something, all keeping track of pieces of the city that refuse to stay buried. I still take the same route I always did, still see the same late-night commuters heading home from their jobs, but now I see the others too, the ones who've been riding longer than they should, longer than anyone could, making sure that nothing important gets forgotten entirely. Last week, a young woman got on at Morrison Street. She's been watching me for 3 nights now, and I can see the questions building behind her eyes. She's starting to notice the pattern, starting to realize that some passengers never get off. Tonight, I think she'll ask me if I'm okay. And when she does, I'll turn to her with the same grateful smile that man gave me 6 months ago. I'll thank her for noticing, and I'll tell her it's her turn to ride. Because someone has to keep the route running. Someone has to remember the stations the city forgot, and the train always finds who it needs. Story 2. Something follows the red line. I was 40 feet down in the tunnel when I heard it breathing behind me. Deep, wet inhalations that echoed off the concrete walls in a rhythm that didn't match human lungs. When I spun around with my flashlight, there was nothing there but empty tracks and the smell of something that had been dead for a long time. But I could hear it moving now, staying just beyond my light, matching my pace as I tried to run back to the surface. That's when I found the handprints on the tunnel wall. Hundreds of them, all pointing deeper into the darkness where something had been making its home for decades. I need to start at the beginning. because what I'm about to tell you goes against everything the transit authority says is possible in our subway system. I'm a maintenance worker for the Metropolitan Transit Agency, and I've been working the Red Line night shift for 6 years. My name is Derek Walsh, and I've never reported what I'm about to share with you, because I need this job, and I can't afford to be labeled as the guy who sees things in the tunnels. The Red Line runs from downtown through the financial district and out to the suburbs, covering about 18 miles of track with 12 above-ground stations and 4 underground stops. During operating hours, trains run every 15 minutes, carrying roughly 40,000 passengers a day. After the last train at 1:47 a.m., the tunnels belong to us. My shift starts at 2 a.m. and runs until 6 a.m., which gives us a 4-hour window to inspect tracks, clear debris, check signal equipment, and make sure everything's safe for morning service. It's solitary work. Each maintenance worker is assigned a specific section to cover alone, and we communicate by radio only when necessary. The silence is actually one of the things I like about the job. After spending days dealing with people and noise and constant demands, there's something peaceful about walking through empty tunnels with just the beam of your flashlight and the distant hum of the electrical systems. Or there was until 3 months ago. It started with sounds that didn't quite fit the normal acoustic landscape of the tunnels. Every maintenance worker gets familiar with the standard noises: water dripping from condensation, the settling and expansion of concrete, the occasional rat scurrying through the drainage channels. But in early September, I began noticing something else: footsteps that seemed to parallel my own movements. At first, I assumed it was echo distortion. The tunnel acoustics can play tricks on you, bouncing sounds around in ways that make your own footfalls seem to come from different directions, but when I stopped walking, the other footsteps continued for a half-second before stopping too. When I started again, they resumed, but with a slight delay, like something was listening for my movements and then mimicking them. I mentioned it to my supervisor, Mike Torres, during one of our weekly safety meetings. He laughed it off and suggested I might be hearing Carlos Mendez, who works the adjacent section of track. But I checked the maintenance schedules. Carlos works the Blue Line tunnel, which runs parallel to mine but is separated by about 60 feet of solid concrete and infrastructure. There's no way I'd be hearing his footsteps that clearly. The following week, the sounds became more distinct and more unsettling. Instead of just parallel footsteps, I started hearing what sounded like breathing, deep labored inhalations that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The acoustics made it impossible to pinpoint the source, but it was definitely organic. Not machinery, not air circulation, but something alive. I started documenting everything in a small notebook I kept in my work jacket. Time of occurrence, location in the tunnel system, duration of the sounds, any environmental factors that might be relevant. I'm not a paranoid person by nature, but 6 years of working alone in underground spaces teaches you to pay attention to details that seem off. October 2nd, 2:34 a.m. Breathing sounds near mile marker 7. Lasted approximately 4 minutes. Stopped when freight train passed on adjacent track. October 4th, 3:17 a.m. Footsteps matching my pace from marker 6 to marker 8. Continued for roughly 20 minutes. No visual confirmation of source. October 9th, 2:45 a.m. Heavy breathing near emergency exit shaft, C4. Sounded closer than previous incidents. Possible wheezing or obstruction in respiratory system. By mid-October, I was certain that something was living in the tunnel system. Not a homeless person. I'd encountered plenty of those over the years, and they leave different kinds of evidence. Food containers, bedding materials, human waste. This was something else entirely. The breakthrough came on October 18th, when I was inspecting a section of track near the old Riverside Station platform. Riverside was one of the original stops built in the 1960s, but it was permanently closed in 1993 due to low ridership and structural issues with the platform. The trains still pass through, but they don't stop, and the station has been sealed off from public access for over 30 years. I was checking the rail joints for wear when my flashlight beam swept across something that shouldn't have been there. Fresh handprints on the tunnel wall. Not just one or two, but dozens of them, pressed into a layer of grime and condensation that had been accumulating for decades. The prints were larger than human hands, and they had an odd, elongated quality to the fingers that made my skin crawl. But what really disturbed me was their arrangement. They weren't random smudges or accidental contact marks. They were deliberate, purposeful, all pointing in the same direction, deeper into the tunnel system, toward the abandoned maintenance shafts that hadn't been used since the original construction. I followed the trail of handprints for about 200 feet until they led to a service access door that should have been locked. The door was slightly ajar, and there was a smell emanating from the opening that I'll never forget, sweet and rotten, like fruit that had been left to decay in a sealed container for months. That's when I heard the breathing again. But this time it was coming from inside the maintenance shaft, close enough that I could hear the wetness in it, the labored quality that suggested serious respiratory distress. But there was also something deliberate about the rhythm, like whatever was making the sound was trying to communicate. I should have backed away immediately, should have radioed for backup, or at minimum reported the security breach to my supervisor. Instead, I found myself pushing the door open wider and shining my flashlight into the shaft. The beam revealed a narrow concrete corridor that extended beyond the reach of my light. The walls were covered with more handprints, but these were different, smeared and overlapping as if whatever had made them had been moving frantically or in distress. And about 10 feet into the corridor, I saw something that made me stumble backward. Clothing. Shreds of fabric that looked like they might once have been a uniform. The breathing stopped. In the sudden silence, I became acutely aware of how alone I was, 40 feet underground with no cell phone signal and the nearest radio checkpoint 20 minutes away. Whatever had been making those sounds knew I was there, and it had chosen to go quiet. That scared me more than the breathing had. I backed away from the shaft, closed the door as quietly as I could, and finished my shift without incident. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. The handprints were too large and too numerous to be from a single person. The smell suggested something that had been living in the tunnels for a long time. And the clothing fragments implied that whatever was down there had encountered other people before. The next night, I brought a camera. Not the standard issue equipment we're supposed to use for documenting maintenance issues, but my personal digital camera with a high-powered flash. If I was going to report this, I needed evidence that couldn't be dismissed as hysteria or imagination. I returned to the service shaft at approximately 2:30 a.m. The door was closed, and there was no immediate sign of activity. But when I examined the handprints on the tunnel wall more carefully, I noticed something I'd missed the previous night. They were still wet. Not damp from condensation, but actually wet, as if they'd been made recently. I photographed everything. The handprints, the door, the trail leading into the depths of the maintenance system. As I was taking the last few shots, I heard movement from inside the shaft. Not breathing this time, but a shuffling, dragging sound like something large being moved across concrete. The sound was getting closer. I don't remember making the conscious decision to run, but I found myself sprinting back toward the main tunnel, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I tried to navigate the uneven track bed. Behind me, I could hear the service door swing open with a metallic groan. The footsteps that followed weren't human. The gate was wrong. Too wide, too irregular, with a dragging quality that suggested injury or deformity. But they were fast, faster than I would have expected, and they were definitely pursuing me. I reached the emergency call box near mile marker 6 and hit the alarm. The response was immediate, sirens, flashing lights, and within 10 minutes, 2 supervisors and a transit police officer were making their way down into the tunnel. But by the time they arrived, whatever had been chasing me was gone. I showed them the photographs. The handprints were clearly visible in the images, as was the open service door. But when we returned to the location, everything had changed. The door was sealed with what looked like decades-old rust. The handprints were gone, as if the wall had been cleaned. Even the smell was absent. The official report listed the incident as a possible break-in by homeless individuals, and additional security measures were implemented for the night shift workers. I was commended for my vigilance and attention to safety protocols. But I knew what I'd experienced, and I knew it wasn't over. The following week, I started hearing about similar incidents from other maintenance workers. Carlos mentioned strange sounds in the Blue Line tunnels. Jennifer Rodriguez, who works the Green Line, reported finding clothing fragments and what looked like nesting materials in abandoned sections of track. Nobody wanted to go on record with their experiences, but the stories were consistent enough to form a pattern. Something was living in the subway system, something that had been there for a long time, moving through the maintenance corridors and sealed-off areas that connected all the different lines. And it was getting bolder. Last month, I was assigned to inspect the emergency lighting system in the deepest section of the Red Line tunnel. It's a part of the system that rarely gets maintenance attention because it's structurally sound and the lighting almost never fails. But there had been reports of flickering in that section, and someone needed to check the electrical connections. I was about 30 minutes into the inspection when I heard my name being called. Not shouted or yelled, but spoken in a conversational tone that seemed to come from deeper in the tunnel system. The voice was human, but there was something wrong with the pronunciation, like someone learning to speak by mimicking sounds they'd heard but didn't fully understand. "Derek," it said again. I grabbed my radio and called for immediate backup, then started moving toward the nearest emergency exit. But as I walked, the voice followed, always staying just beyond the reach of my flashlight. Sometimes it would call my name. Other times it would mimic the radio chatter from my communications device, repeating phrases in that same stilted learning-to-speak cadence. The backup team found me 20 minutes later, sitting by the emergency exit in what they described as a state of severe distress. I tried to explain what had happened, but the voice had stopped as soon as other people entered the tunnel. The official report attributed my experience to fatigue and stress, and I was given a week of paid leave to recover. I spent that week researching the history of the Red Line construction. What I found in the city archives made everything worse. In 1967, during the initial excavation for the tunnel system, 3 construction workers disappeared. Their names were James Holloway, Robert Chen, and Michael Torres, the same name as my current supervisor, though obviously a different person. The official report stated that they were trapped in a tunnel collapse and their bodies were never recovered. But there were witness statements from other workers describing strange sounds in the collapsed section, sounds that continued for weeks after the incident. The construction was completed on schedule, and the missing workers were officially declared dead. But according to several informal accounts, maintenance workers in the early years reported encounters with figures in the tunnels, who wore construction uniforms and seemed to be lost or confused. The report stopped in the mid-1970s, and everyone assumed the sightings had been grief-induced hallucinations or urban legends. But what if they hadn't died in the collapse? What if they'd been trapped in the maintenance system, living in the sealed-off areas, surviving somehow for decades? It would explain the handprints, the sounds, the clothing fragments. It would explain why whatever is down there knows the layout of the tunnels so well, why it can move through areas that should be inaccessible. And it would explain why it seemed to recognize my name. Maintenance workers' names and schedules are posted in various locations throughout the tunnel system. I returned to work after my leave, but I requested a transfer to day shift maintenance. The request was denied due to staffing needs, so I'm still working nights. But now I take different routes through the tunnel system, and I never work alone in the deeper sections. I carry backup lights, extra radio batteries, and a can of pepper spray that I bought with my own money. The sounds have continued, but they're different now. Less investigative, more aggressive. Sometimes I hear what sounds like multiple voices calling my name from different directions. Other times I find evidence of recent activity, disturbed debris, fresh handprints, tools that have been moved from where I left them. 2 weeks ago, I found a note tucked into my equipment locker. Written in what looked like charcoal on a piece of cardboard, it said, "We remember the surface, we remember the light." I haven't reported the note to my supervisor. I haven't told anyone about it except you. Because I'm starting to understand that whatever is living in those tunnels isn't malicious. It's lost, trapped for decades in a system that was built around them, forgotten by everyone except the maintenance workers who occasionally cross their path. But understanding doesn't make me less afraid, because every night when I descend into those tunnels, I can feel them watching me. I can hear them moving through the maintenance shafts, getting closer, becoming more desperate. And I know that eventually they're going to ask for more than just acknowledgement. They're going to ask me to help them find their way back to the surface, and I don't know if the people up there are ready for what's been living underneath their city for the past 57 years. I'd been riding this line for 2 years, and there was no Millbrook Street. The platform was empty, the air smelled like copper and old water, and when I checked my phone, there was no signal. The doors opened. Nobody got on or off except me because I panicked and stumbled out at the last second. 3 hours later, when I finally found my way back to street level, my phone showed no record of the time I'd lost. But I still have the ticket stub. It's dated 1987. Let me explain how I ended up in that situation, because it started as the most ordinary night imaginable. I work at Sacred Heart Hospital as a nursing assistant, and we were short-staffed due to a flu outbreak among the staff. What should have been a normal 8-hour shift turned into 16 hours of back-to-back patient care, medication rounds, and emergency responses. By the time I finally clocked out at 11:30 p.m., I was running on pure adrenaline and caffeine. The hospital is downtown and I live in Riverside, which means taking the Orange Line out to the suburbs. It's usually a 40-minute ride, and I've done it so many times I could probably navigate it in my sleep, which, as it turned out, became exactly the problem. I caught the 11:45 train without any issues. Found a seat near the back, put in my earbuds, and settled back for the familiar rhythm of stops and announcements that would carry me home. The car was mostly empty except for a few other late shift workers and one businessman in an expensive suit who kept checking his watch nervously. I remember pulling away from Central Station and thinking about how I needed to grocery shop tomorrow. How I should probably do laundry, how I was definitely going to sleep until at least noon. Normal end-of-shift thoughts that occupied my mind as the train swayed through the tunnels and emerged into the above-ground portions of the route. Somewhere around Oakwood Station, exhaustion caught up with me. I dozed off with my head against the window, lulled by the rhythmic clacking of the rails and the gentle motion of the car. It wasn't deep sleep, more like that twilight state where you're aware of movement and sound, but not consciously processing them. I don't know how long I was out, but I woke up to the mechanical voice announcing the next stop. Next stop, Millbrook Street. That pulled me fully awake because I knew every stop on this line by heart, and there was no Millbrook Street. I sat up, looking around the car to see if other passengers were reacting to the unfamiliar announcement, but the businessman was gone and I was the only person left in the car. Through the windows, I could see we were approaching a station platform, but something about it looked wrong. The lighting was dimmer than usual, and the architectural style was different from the modern stations I was used to. The tile work looked older, more ornate, like something from decades ago. I pulled out my phone to check the transit app, thinking maybe there had been a route change or emergency rerouting that I hadn't heard about, but my phone showed no signal, not even the single bar I usually got in the underground sections. The train was slowing down, and I could see the station name more clearly now. Millbrook Street, in white tiles against a dark green background. The font was different too, more elaborate than the standard modern signage used throughout the system. This is where I should have stayed on the train. Should have trusted that whatever routing error had occurred would eventually correct itself and carry me to a familiar stop where I could figure out what was happening. But panic makes you do stupid things, and as the doors hissed open, I found myself stumbling out onto the platform. The doors closed behind me immediately and the train pulled away, leaving me alone in a station that shouldn't have existed. The platform was completely deserted, but it didn't feel abandoned, more like it was waiting for something. The air was thick and humid with a metallic taste that reminded me of old copper pipes and stagnant water. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting uneven shadows that seemed to move independently of any physical objects. I walked toward what I assumed would be the exit, looking for maps or directional signs that might help me understand where I was. The walls were covered with vintage advertising posters that looked authentic but advertised products and services I'd never heard of. The style was definitely mid-20th century, but the posters looked fresh, as if they'd been put up recently. There was no fading, no wear, no graffiti or vandalism that you'd expect to see on advertising that had been up for decades. I found a transit map mounted on the wall near what looked like the main exit. According to the map, Millbrook Street was indeed a stop on the Orange Line, positioned between Oakwood and Riverside, exactly where I should have been. But the map also showed stations I'd never heard of: Pine Lake, Sunnyside Gardens, Brookfield Commons. The entire route was different, like an alternate version of the transit system I knew. That's impossible, I thought. The Orange Line wasn't even built until the early 2000s. I'd researched the transit system's history for a college paper, and I was certain that the suburban extensions hadn't existed in the 1980s. I took a photo of the map with my phone, though the image came out strangely distorted, with dark areas where there should have been text and strange color shifts that made everything look sepia-toned. The exit led to a stairway that climbed much higher than I expected. In the normal stations, you usually climb 1 or 2 flights to reach street level, but this stairway seemed to go on forever, with landings every 20 steps or so, but no doors or alternative exits. The walls were plain concrete, and the only lighting came from bare bulbs strung along the ceiling at irregular intervals. As I climbed, I became aware of sounds echoing from somewhere above me, distant traffic, but muffled and distorted like it was coming through several layers of material. There were also voices, fragments of conversation that I couldn't quite make out, as if people were talking in rooms adjacent to the stairway but separated by thick walls. After what felt like 10 minutes of climbing, I finally reached what appeared to be street level. The exit door was heavy metal, unmarked, and when I pushed it open, I stepped out into a neighborhood I'd never seen before. The architecture was wrong for the city I knew. Instead of the modern apartment complexes and chain businesses that characterized the Riverside area, I found myself on a tree-lined street with small houses that looked like they were from the 1950s or 60s. The streetlights were old-fashioned, casting yellow circles of light that created deep shadows between them. The most unsettling part was the silence. It was past midnight in what should have been a populated area, but there was no traffic, no lights in windows, no sign of life anywhere. The houses looked maintained but empty, as if everyone had simply vanished while leaving everything else perfectly in place. I started walking, hoping to find a main street or some landmark that would help me orient myself. My phone still had no signal, and the GPS showed my location as a blank area with no street names or points of interest. According to the phone, I was nowhere. The houses I passed were all similar. Modest single-story homes with small front yards and driveways that held cars from decades past. A 1965 Buick Skylark, a 1970 Ford Mustang, a 1978 Chevrolet Impala, all in perfect condition as if they'd just rolled off the lot, but covered with a thin layer of dust that suggested they hadn't been moved in years. I walked for what felt like miles, but the neighborhood never changed. Same style houses, same vintage cars, same empty windows staring out at streets that no one walked. Occasionally I'd see a porch light on, but when I approached those houses they seemed as vacant as all the others. It was around 2:30 a.m., according to my phone, though I had no way to verify that the time was accurate, when I finally found what looked like a commercial district. A small cluster of businesses arranged around a town square, all closed but lit by streetlights that revealed hand-painted signs and storefronts that looked frozen in time. The diner sign was lit, and I could see warm light spilling from the windows, so I walked over to investigate. Through the windows, I could see the interior clearly. Red vinyl booths, a chrome counter with rotating stools, a pie case displaying what looked like fresh desserts. But there were no customers, no staff, no signs of life. The coffee pot was on, steam rising from the spout, but no one was there to pour it. I tried the door and it opened easily. Inside, the diner was warm and filled with the smell of coffee and frying bacon, as if someone had just been cooking. There were half-finished meals on some of the tables, newspapers folded open to pages dated September 12, 1987, coffee cups that were still warm to the touch. But no people anywhere. I sat down at the counter, trying to process what was happening to me. Every rational explanation seemed inadequate. This wasn't a dream. I was too aware, too able to interact with the environment. It wasn't a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. The details were too consistent, too elaborate. And it wasn't some kind of elaborate prank or movie set. The scale was too large, too complete. I was in a place that existed but shouldn't have, populated by evidence of people who weren't there, in a time that didn't match the world I knew. I found a phone book behind the counter and looked up my own address. According to the directory dated 1987, my apartment building didn't exist. The street I lived on was listed, but with different house numbers and different residents. I looked up Sacred Heart Hospital and found it listed with a different address and a much smaller staff directory. It was as if I'd stepped into an alternate version of my city, one where development had stopped in the 1980s and everyone had simply disappeared while leaving everything else intact. I stayed in the diner until sunrise, drinking coffee that refilled itself from pots that never emptied, trying to figure out how to get back to the world I knew. As dawn approached, I could hear sounds of life returning to the neighborhood. Car engines starting, doors closing, the distant murmur of conversation. But when I looked out the diner windows, the streets were still empty. Around 7 a.m., I decided to retrace my steps back to the subway entrance. Maybe the same system that had brought me here could take me back. I found the unmarked door I'd exited through, but now it opened onto a different stairway, shorter, better lit, leading down to a modern subway platform that looked exactly like the Riverside station I knew. A train was waiting, doors open with normal morning commuters heading into the city for work. I got on without hesitation, not caring where it was going as long as it was moving through the transit system I recognized. 20 minutes later, I was back at Central Station, surrounded by familiar sights and sounds and people. My phone had full signal again, my GPS showed my correct location, and everything seemed normal except for one thing. According to my phone, no time had passed. It showed the same timestamp as when I dozed off on the original train. But I had the photos I'd taken in the station, though they were distorted and dark. I had the coffee stains on my jacket from the diner, and I had the ticket stub from the train that had taken me to Millbrook Street, a stub that showed a date of September 12, 1987, and a destination that didn't exist on any official transit map. I've researched everything I can about Millbrook Street and the area I found myself in. In city planning documents from the 1960s, there are references to a proposed suburban development called Millbrook Commons, which would have included residential areas, commercial districts, and a transit connection to downtown. The project was approved and construction began, but it was abandoned in 1987 due to budget constraints and environmental concerns. According to the official records, the partially completed infrastructure was demolished and the land was returned to its natural state. But what I experienced suggests that somewhere, in some version of reality, that development was completed and populated, then abandoned for reasons no one recorded. I still take the Orange Line home from work, but I make sure to stay awake for the entire journey. I've never seen Millbrook Street on any departure board or heard it announced over the intercom. But sometimes, late at night when the train is mostly empty, I catch glimpses of station platforms that don't match the official stops, and I hear the conductor's voice announcing destinations that aren't on the map. I keep the ticket stub in my wallet as a reminder that there are places in this city, maybe in every city, that exist in the spaces between what was planned and what was built, populated by the echoes of lives that were supposed to happen but never did. And sometimes when I'm very tired and not paying close attention, those places call to you through the subway system, inviting you to step off at stops that shouldn't exist, into neighborhoods where time moves differently and the coffee never gets cold. Story 4. I saw myself get on at the last stop. The train pulled away from Riverside Station and I was settling in for the ride home when the doors opened at the next stop and I watched myself get on. Same coat, same bag, same exhausted slouch from working a double shift. She didn't look at me as she took a seat 3 rows ahead, but when we reached downtown and she stood to get off, she turned around and looked right at me. Her smile was exactly like mine, but her eyes were completely black. I still take that train every night because I don't have a choice. But now I check every face that gets on, wondering which one of them might be me. I have to start by explaining my routine because routines matter when something impossible interrupts them. I'm a bartender at a place called The Anchor downtown, and my shifts run Tuesday through Saturday, 4 p.m. to 2 a.m. It's consistent money, decent tips, and the regular customers know me well enough to make the work feel like actual conversation rather than just service. The last train out to Riverside leaves at 2:47 a.m., which gives me exactly enough time to close down the bar, count the register, and walk the 4 blocks to Central Station. I've been doing this same routine for 8 months, ever since I moved to an apartment in Riverside that I could actually afford on a bartender's salary. The late train is always nearly empty, which I prefer after spending 8 hours dealing with crowds of people. Usually it's just me, maybe a hospital worker getting off a night shift. Occasionally someone who stayed out too late and missed the earlier trains. We all keep to ourselves, united by exhaustion and the shared understanding that 3 a.m. is not a social hour. Tuesday, November 14th started like any other night. Busy dinner crowd, steady drinks until last call. The usual closing routine that I could do in my sleep. I caught the 2:47 train without any problems. Found my preferred seat in the back corner where I could lean against the window and settled in for the familiar 40-minute ride home. The first few stops passed normally. Downtown to Financial District to University, picking up the occasional passenger but never crowding. I was scrolling through my phone, reading random articles to decompress from the shift when we pulled into Riverside Station. This is where I need to be very clear about what happened because I know how it sounds. As the train slowed to a stop, I looked up from my phone out of habit. Riverside is my stop, and even though we had several more to go, I always noted it as a landmark. The platform was empty except for one person waiting to board, a woman in a dark coat carrying a messenger bag. She looked exactly like me, not similar. Identical, same height, same build, same way of holding her shoulders when she's tired. Same coat that I'd bought 3 months ago, same bag I carried to work every day, same face that I saw in the mirror every morning. The doors opened and she got on the train. I watched her walk down the aisle, moving with my exact gait, my exact mannerisms. She didn't look around to survey the car like most passengers do. Didn't check for empty seats or acknowledge the other passengers. Just walked purposefully to a seat 3 rows ahead of me and sat down, facing forward. My rational mind was scrambling for explanations. Twin sister I'd somehow never heard about. Remarkable coincidence combined with poor lighting and my own exhaustion. Stress-induced hallucination brought on by too many late shifts and not enough sleep. But I knew what I was seeing, and I knew it wasn't any of those things. She was wearing my coat. I was certain because there was a small coffee stain on the left sleeve that I'd gotten 2 weeks ago when a customer bumped into me. I could see the stain from where I sat in exactly the same place where it existed on the coat I was currently wearing. I looked down at my own sleeve. The stain was there too. The train started moving again, and I found myself staring at the back of her head, trying to process what was happening. Her hair was the same length as mine, the same color, with the same slightly uneven cut that I'd gotten from a cheap salon 6 weeks ago. When she shifted in her seat, I could see her profile, and it was unmistakably my own face, but there was something subtly wrong about her movements. They were too precise, too deliberate, like someone consciously performing actions rather than moving naturally. When she reached into her bag, my bag, she did it with the careful attention of someone following a script. I wanted to get up and approach her to confirm what I was seeing, but I found myself paralyzed by a fear I couldn't name. Every instinct I had was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong, that approaching her would be the worst possible decision I could make. The train continued through the remaining stops: Hillcrest, Oakwood, Pine Valley. At each platform, she would turn her head slightly toward the windows and I would catch glimpses of her face, my face, but there were small details that didn't match. The expression was too neutral, too vacant, like someone wearing a mask of my features but not quite getting the personality right. As we approached downtown, the end of the line, she stood up and moved toward the doors. This was wrong because downtown was where I'd started my journey, not where someone getting on at Riverside would logically be going, but she seemed to know exactly where she was headed. The train pulled into Central Station and she walked toward the exit. Just before stepping off, she turned around and looked directly at me. Her smile was perfect. Exactly the way I smile when I'm genuinely happy, with the slight asymmetry that makes my left cheek dimple more than my right. But her eyes were completely black, not dark brown like mine, not dilated pupils in dim light, but solid black from edge to edge. She held my gaze for about 3 seconds, then stepped off the train. The doors closed, and she was gone. I sat there as the train prepared for its return journey, trying to convince myself that I'd experienced some kind of breakdown. But when I checked my phone to distract myself, I found something that made my blood stop. A text message sent from my own number. "Thanks for the ride." The message had been sent at 3:34 a.m., which was exactly when she'd gotten off the train. I don't remember the rest of the ride home. I must have stayed on the train for the return trip to Riverside, must have walked to my apartment, must have gone through all the normal motions of ending a night. But my next clear memory is sitting on my couch at 5 a.m., staring at that text message and trying to figure out what it meant. I called my own number from my landline. It went straight to voicemail, my voicemail, with my voice giving the standard greeting. But there was background noise in the recording that I didn't remember being there before, what sounded like train wheels on tracks, very faint but definitely present. The next night, I almost called in sick to work. The rational thing would have been to take a different train or arrange for someone to pick me up or even walk home if necessary. But something compelled me to follow my normal routine to take the 2:47 train and see if she would be there again. She was. Same platform, same time, same everything. But this time, when she got on the train, she sat one row closer to me. And when she turned around at Central Station, her smile was more familiar, more genuinely mine, as if she'd been practicing. The text message came again. "Getting better at this. This became the pattern. Every night she would board at Riverside, sit slightly closer to me, and her mannerisms would become more natural, more authentically mine. The messages became more frequent too and more personal. "Remember when we were 8 and fell off the bike?" The nightmare about drowning. She was learning to be me, and somehow my presence on the train was facilitating the process. But I couldn't stop taking it. Every time I considered finding an alternative way home, I would feel this overwhelming compulsion to stick to my routine, as if breaking the pattern would result in something much worse than continuing it. After 2 weeks, she was sitting directly across from me. Her movements were indistinguishable from my own. Her expressions perfectly matched my unconscious habits, and her eyes had changed from solid black to dark brown. Exactly the same shade as mine, but there were still subtle differences that unsettled me. She never blinked at the right intervals. Her breathing was too measured, too conscious, and sometimes when she thought I wasn't looking, her face would go completely blank, like a computer screen between programs. "Almost ready." That last message terrified me because it implied that whatever process was happening had a conclusion, and that conclusion involved something happening to me. I started carrying a pocket knife, though I wasn't sure what I thought I could do with it, against someone who was somehow absorbing my identity. 3 weeks into this routine, she started getting off at different stops. First Hillcrest, then Oakwood, then Pine Valley. Each time she would turn and smile before leaving, and each time the smile was more confident, more genuine. She was testing her ability to navigate my life, to exist in spaces where I was supposed to be. I followed her once, getting off at Hillcrest and trying to track where she went. But she seemed to know I was following, and she led me through a series of residential streets that formed a perfect circle, bringing me back to the station where another train was waiting. She was standing in the doorway, gesturing for me to get on, and her expression was patient and amused, like she was dealing with a child who was being unnecessarily difficult. I got on the train. The messages that week became more urgent. "Stop fighting this. I can do your job now. Talk to 3 regulars today. Your landlord thinks you've been acting strange lately." She'd been living pieces of my life during the day, interacting with people I knew, making decisions that affected my real existence. When I got to work the next evening, my manager asked if I was feeling okay, said I'd seemed off during my last few shifts. But I'd only worked 1 shift in the past week. Last Friday night, she didn't get off the train at all. She rode past Central Station, past the end of the line, staying on as the train turned around for the return journey. When we reached Riverside again, she finally stood up and walked to where I was sitting. "This is my stop now," she said, and her voice was exactly mine. She stepped off the train, and I watched through the window as she walked up the stairs toward the street, toward my apartment, toward my life. I stayed on the train for the return trip, then caught the next one back, then the next one after that. I've been riding the same route for 4 days now, getting off occasionally to buy food or use restrooms in the stations, but always getting back on. Because I understand now that she was right. This is her stop now. The last text message I received was sent yesterday. "Don't worry. I'll take good care of everything, and if you ever want to see how I'm doing, just take the 2:47 train." I see her sometimes boarding at Riverside, but now she looks through me like I'm not there. She's perfected my mannerisms, my expressions, even the way I hold my phone when I'm reading. To anyone else on the train, she would be indistinguishable from the original. But I notice the small things that are still wrong. She blinks too regularly, like she's counting the intervals. Her breathing follows a pattern that's just slightly off human rhythm. And sometimes, when she thinks no one is watching, her reflection in the window shows something else entirely. Something with black eyes and too many teeth. I don't know what she is or where she came from. I don't know if there are others like her, riding different trains, learning to be different people. But I know that somewhere in Riverside, in my apartment, living my life, there's something wearing my face and doing a better job of being me than I ever did. The irony is that I'm probably happier now than I've been in years. No responsibilities, no bills, no pressure to maintain relationships or succeed at anything. Just the endless, soothing routine of riding the same train, through the same stations, watching the city scroll past in an eternal loop. But every night when the 2:47 pulls into Riverside Station, I find myself checking the faces of the passengers who board. Because I'm starting to understand that this process isn't unique to me. There are others on this train who look just a little too perfect, who move just a little too carefully, who never seem to get off at the stops where logic says they should. And sometimes I catch them looking back at me with eyes that haven't quite learned how to be human yet. And I wonder if they're still perfecting their performances, still learning how to wear the lives they've stolen. I wonder if someday one of them will smile at me with a face I recognize, and I'll realize that I've been watching myself all along. And the person I think I am now is just another copy riding an endless loop while something else lives my life better than I ever could. Story 5. The conductor knocked on my window. I woke up to knocking on the train window right next to my head. We were in a tunnel, moving at full speed, nothing but darkness rushing past outside. But there was a man in a conductor's uniform standing on the other side of the glass, matching our pace perfectly, knocking steadily with his knuckles while his mouth moved like he was trying to tell me something urgent. He was outside the train, in the tunnel, keeping perfect step with us while we traveled at 40 miles per hour through underground darkness. And then all the lights inside the car went out. I need to explain the circumstances that led to me being asleep on the subway at 1:30 in the morning, because it wasn't something I made a habit of. I'd been at my girlfriend Sarah's apartment in Brooklyn helping her move bees to storage before her lease ended. What was supposed to be a quick evening of packing turned into an all-night marathon when we discovered that 3 years of living together had accumulated way more stuff than either of us realized. We'd been drinking wine while we worked. Not smart in retrospect, but it made the tedious job of sorting through old clothes and books feel more social. By the time we finished loading the last box into her car, It was past midnight and I was exhausted, buzzed, and faced with a 40-minute subway ride back to Manhattan. Sarah offered to let me crash on her couch, but I had an early meeting the next morning and all my work clothes were at my place. The responsible thing would have been to call a rideshare, but I was trying to save money and the subway ran all night. How many times had I taken late trains without incident? Hundreds, probably. The platform was nearly empty when I caught the L train heading west. Just me, a couple of hospital workers finishing a shift, and one guy in a business suit who looked like he'd had an even longer day than I had. I found a seat in the middle of the car, wedged myself into the corner where I could lean against the window, and figured I'd doze lightly until we reached my stop. The wine and exhaustion hit me harder than I expected. Instead of the light nap I'd planned, I fell into deep sleep almost immediately, lulled by the rhythmic clacking of the wheels and the gentle swaying of the car. I have vague memories of stations passing by, the hiss of doors opening and closing, the gradual emptying of the car as other passengers reached their destinations. The knocking woke me, not loud but persistent and rhythmic, like someone trying to get attention without being aggressive about it. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause. It took me several seconds to fully surface from sleep and orient myself to where the sound was coming from. We were in a tunnel. I could see the darkness rushing past the windows, broken occasionally by the industrial lighting that marked emergency exits and maintenance areas. The car was empty except for me. Everyone else had gotten off while I slept. The knocking was coming from directly outside my window. I turned my head and found myself face to face with a man in a dark blue uniform. He was standing upright, perfectly parallel to the train, matching our speed exactly. His conductor's cap was positioned precisely. His uniform was neat and pressed, and he was knocking on the glass with the steady patience of someone who had been trying to get my attention for a while. My first thought was that I was still dreaming. There was no way someone could be standing outside a moving train keeping pace with us, especially not in the middle of a tunnel. But I was fully awake now, alert and focused. And the man was undeniably there. He was middle-aged, maybe 50, with a weathered face and gray hair visible under his cap. His expression was urgent but not panicked, like he was trying to communicate something important but didn't want to alarm me. His mouth was moving constantly, forming words I couldn't hear through the glass and the noise of the train. I pressed my face closer to the window, trying to read his lips or understand what he was attempting to tell me. The tunnel lighting strobed past him as we moved, creating a flickering effect that made it difficult to focus on his features, but his eyes were locked on mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He raised his free hand and pointed ahead deeper into the tunnel, his mouth forming what looked like "stop" or "don't" over and over again. Then he pointed back toward where we'd come from, gesturing emphatically like he was trying to warn me about something behind us. I looked around the empty car, searching for what he might be indicating. Everything appeared normal. Standard subway car interior, fluorescent lighting, the usual advertisements and maps. But when I turned back to the window, he was closer to the glass, his face inches from mine, his knocking more insistent. That's when I realized something that made my blood freeze. He wasn't running alongside the train. He wasn't on a parallel track or maintenance walkway. He was somehow suspended in empty air, keeping perfect pace with us through the tunnel, defying every law of physics I understood. I fumbled for my phone, thinking I needed to record this or call someone or do anything that might help me process what I was seeing. But when I looked at the screen, there was no signal and the time display was flickering between different readouts. 1:47, 11:23, 3:15, 9:08. The numbers changed randomly every few seconds, as if the phone couldn't determine what time it actually was. The conductor, if that's what he was, saw me looking at my phone and shook his head violently, pointing again toward the front of the train. His expression had shifted from urgent to desperate, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the fact that he was outside in what should have been cold tunnel air. I tried to stand up, to move to a different part of the car where I might get a better perspective on what was happening. But my legs wouldn't respond properly. It wasn't paralysis exactly, more like the heavy, uncooperative feeling you get when you're trying to move in a nightmare. I could shift in my seat, could move my arms normally, but standing up seemed impossible. The train began to slow down, though I couldn't see any indication of an approaching station. The conductor outside my window became more agitated, his knocking turning into what looked like pounding, though I still couldn't hear any sound from his efforts. As our speed decreased, I could see more details of the tunnel around us. The walls were older than I expected, built with a different style of brickwork than the modern subway system I was familiar with. There were alcoves and passages branching off from the main tunnel that didn't appear on any transit map I'd ever seen. And in some of those alcoves, I caught glimpses of other figures. People in uniforms similar to the conductors, standing motionless in the shadows, watching our train pass. There were dozens of them, maybe more, all positioned at regular intervals like they were manning posts that no longer had any official purpose. The train came to a complete stop. We weren't at a station. We were in the middle of the tunnel, surrounded by darkness and those watching figures. The conductor outside my window had stopped knocking and was now pressed flat against the glass, his face contorted with what looked like terror. Behind him, I could see other uniformed figures moving closer to the train. They walked with the stiff, mechanical gait of people who hadn't moved naturally in a very long time. Some were carrying lanterns that cast weird, flickering light that didn't behave the way normal light should. Others held clipboards and were writing frantically as if documenting something important about our presence in their tunnel. All the lights in the car went out simultaneously. In the complete darkness, I could hear sounds that hadn't been audible before. Footsteps on the roof of the car moving from front to back with deliberate purpose. The screech of metal on metal like someone prying at door mechanisms, voices calling to each other in the darkness using words I couldn't understand, but that sounded like technical railroad terminology from a different era. My phone's screen provided the only light, though it was still flickering between random times and now showing a battery level that changed from 87% to 23% to 65% without any logic. In its weak glow, I could see that the interior of the car had changed. The modern advertisements were gone, replaced by older signs advertising products from decades ago. The seat upholstery was different too. Older style, different colors, as if the car itself had transformed while the lights were out. Something scraped against the window where the conductor had been standing. Not knocking this time, but a slow, deliberate scratching like fingernails on glass. I pressed the home button on my phone repeatedly, trying to get more light, and in one of the brief illuminations I saw a face pressed against the window. Not the conductor. Someone else entirely. A woman in what looked like a ticket taker's uniform from the 1940s or 50s. Her skin was gray and her eyes were completely white, but she was smiling at me with genuine warmth, like she recognized me and was happy to see me again. She tapped gently on the glass with one finger, and when I looked down at her hand, I saw that her fingernails were about 3 inches long and appeared to be made of the same metal as the train tracks. The lights came back on abruptly and everything was normal again. Modern car, contemporary advertisements, my phone showing a steady time and battery level. Outside the windows, I could see we were approaching a familiar station, 14th Street, Union Square, exactly where I needed to transfer to get home. The train pulled into the station smoothly and the doors opened with their usual hiss. Normal late-night passengers were waiting on the platform, a few club kids heading home, Someone in scrubs who might have been medical personnel, a janitor with a cart full of cleaning supplies. I got off the train immediately, not looking back, and caught the next connection without incident. The rest of my journey home was completely ordinary, and I was in my apartment within 20 minutes, but when I checked my phone the next morning, I found photos in my camera roll that I didn't remember taking. Dozens of them, all apparently shot during my time on the train. Most were too dark to make out clearly, but a few showed the interior of the car I'd been riding. And it definitely wasn't a modern subway car. The seats were older, the lighting was different, and the advertisements on the walls were for products and services that hadn't existed in decades. In one photo, I could see my own reflection in the window. But standing behind me in the car were at least 6 people in vintage railroad uniforms, all looking directly at the camera. In another photo, taken apparently while the lights were out, there were faces pressed against every window of the car. Dozens of faces, all wearing expressions of desperate longing, as if they were trapped outside and trying to communicate with someone inside who could help them. But the most disturbing photo was the last one in the sequence. It showed the conductor who had been knocking on my window. But he was inside the car now, sitting in the seat directly across from where I had been sleeping. He was looking straight at the camera, and his mouth was open as if he was speaking or screaming, though the image was obviously silent. Pinned to his uniform was a badge with a date, September 15th, 1953. I researched that date and found records of a major subway accident that occurred on September 15th, 1953. A train carrying 47 passengers and crew had derailed in a tunnel between stations due to a signal malfunction. Everyone on board was killed, and the accident led to major safety improvements in the subway system. But according to the official report, the bodies of the crew members were never recovered. The conductor, 2 engineers, and 3 ticket takers were listed as missing, presumed dead, but their remains were never found despite extensive searches of the tunnel and surrounding areas. The accident occurred in a section of tunnel that was later abandoned and sealed off when the subway routes were modernized in the 1960s. That tunnel system still exists, running parallel to some of the current lines, but it's been closed to passenger service for over 60 years. I think that's where I was that night. Somehow, the train I was riding had switched to the abandoned tracks, carrying me through tunnels that still held the echoes of that 1953 disaster. The crew members who were never found are still down there, still trying to do their jobs, still attempting to warn passengers about the dangers they can no longer prevent. The conductor who knocked on my window wasn't trying to hurt me. He was trying to save me from ending up like them, trapped forever in a system that no longer officially exists, riding routes that don't appear on any current map, serving passengers who disappeared decades ago. I still take the subway, but I'm much more careful about falling asleep on late trains. And sometimes when we pass through certain underground sections, I catch glimpses of figures standing in maintenance alcoves or emergency exits, people in uniforms that are decades out of date, watching the trains pass with expressions of infinite sadness. They're still working, still trying to keep the system running smoothly, still attempting to warn passengers about accidents that happened 70 years ago but somehow continue to echo through the tunnels beneath the city. And sometimes, very late at night when the trains are nearly empty, I hear knocking on the windows, gentle, persistent knocking from people who want desperately to help, trapped forever in a job they can never finish, watching over a system that has moved on without them. Story 6. The passenger who never blinked. There's a woman on my morning commute who never blinks. I've been watching her for 2 months now, timing it, studying her in the reflection of the windows. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15. Her eyes never close. She stands perfectly still near the back doors, staring straight ahead at nothing. And last week I followed her off the train just to see where she went. She walked directly into the tunnel where the trains come from. Not toward an exit, not toward the street. Into the darkness where passengers aren't supposed to go. And this morning she was back on the train like nothing had happened, standing in her usual spot. But now she positions herself directly across from me, and when I look up from my phone, she's always watching. I want to start by establishing that I'm not someone who usually pays attention to other passengers. I take the red line downtown every morning at 7:15, and like most commuters, I keep to myself. Earbuds in, phone out, minimal eye contact with strangers. It's an unspoken rule of public transportation. We're all just trying to get through our daily routines without unnecessary social interaction. But this woman made herself impossible to ignore. I first noticed her about 2 months ago, sometime in early October. She was standing near the back doors of the car, facing forward, completely motionless. What caught my attention initially wasn't anything dramatic. It was actually her stillness that seemed unusual. Most people sway with the train's movement, shift their weight, check their phones, look around. She did none of those things. She appeared to be in her 30s, average height, wearing a dark coat that looked expensive but not flashy. Her hair was brown, pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her posture was perfectly upright. Nothing about her appearance was particularly memorable except for her absolute immobility. I started noticing her more frequently after that first encounter. She seemed to take the same train as me most mornings, always in the same car, always standing in the same position near the back doors, always facing forward with that same rigid posture. It was probably the third or fourth time I saw her that I realized she never blinked. I was sitting in my usual seat about halfway through the car when I happened to glance up from my phone and make eye contact with her reflection in the window. She was staring straight ahead, but the angle allowed me to see her profile clearly. Her eyes were wide open, focused on some fixed point in the distance, and as I watched, I became aware that her eyelids never moved. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the lighting or the angle of reflection, but I found myself timing it, counting seconds while watching her in the glass. 30 seconds, 45, a full minute, no blinking. Her eyes didn't even seem to water, which should have been automatic after that amount of time without moisture. I started paying more deliberate attention to her after that, though I tried to be subtle about it. I would position myself where I could observe her reflection, or catch glimpses of her face when other passengers moved around the car. The result was always the same: perfect stillness, unwavering forward gaze, no blinking. Over the course of several weeks, I began timing her more systematically. I would note when I first saw her on the train and track how long she maintained that unblinking stare. 5 minutes was common. 10 minutes wasn't unusual. The longest I ever timed was 17 minutes and 34 seconds from when she got on at Riverside until she got off downtown. 17 minutes without blinking once. I tried to research medical conditions that might explain this. There are rare disorders that affect blinking patterns, and certain medications can cause reduced blink rates. But what I was observing went well beyond any medical explanation I could find. This was complete absence of blinking for extended periods, combined with an unnatural stillness that suggested something fundamentally different about her physiology. I also started paying attention to other passengers' reactions to her. Most people seemed to not notice her at all, which struck me as strange given how obviously unusual her behavior was. Even when the train was crowded and people were packed closely together, others seemed to unconsciously avoid the space around her, creating a small bubble of emptiness even during rush hour. The few times I saw someone notice her directly, their reaction was immediate discomfort. They would glance at her, do a double take as they registered something was off, then quickly look away and move to a different part of the car. No one ever approached her or tried to interact with her in any way. I became somewhat obsessed with understanding what was happening. I started taking earlier or later trains occasionally to see if she appeared at different times. But I never saw her except on the 7:15. I tried sitting in different parts of the car to get better angles of observation. I even brought a book with a reflective cover so I could watch her more discreetly. The more I observed, the more convinced I became that she wasn't entirely human. Her breathing was wrong, too regular, too controlled, like someone consciously managing each inhalation and exhalation rather than breathing naturally. Her posture never shifted even slightly despite the train's movement and vibration. And most unsettling, her facial expression never changed. Not even the micro-expressions that are involuntary in normal human interaction. But it was her eyes that really disturbed me. They weren't just unblinking, they were too focused, too intense, like she was concentrating on something specific that no one else could see. And occasionally I would catch her pupils dilating and contracting in patterns that didn't correspond to changes in lighting. 3 weeks ago, I decided to follow her. I know how that sounds, and I know it was inappropriate and potentially dangerous behavior. But I'd become so fixated on understanding what she was that I convinced myself I needed to know where she went, what she did when she wasn't standing motionless on the train. On a Friday morning when she got off at Central Station like she always did, I got off too. Instead of heading toward my office, I stayed about 20 feet behind her, trying to look like just another commuter heading in the same direction. She walked with the same rigid purposefulness that characterized her behavior on the train. Straight lines, no hesitation, no deviation from her path. She didn't look around, didn't check her phone, didn't acknowledge other pedestrians who had to step around her, instead of heading toward any of the street exits. She walked deeper into the station complex, past the main platforms, past the customer service areas, toward the maintenance corridors that most passengers don't even know exist. I'd never been in that part of the station, but I followed anyway, staying far enough back that I hoped she wouldn't notice. The corridors became narrower and less well lit as we went deeper. There were fewer people than no people at all except for the two of us. The walls changed from modern tile to older concrete, and I could hear the sound of trains in the distance but couldn't tell which direction they were coming from. She stopped at a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only" and stood there for about 30 seconds, completely still. Then the door opened. Not because she touched it or used a key, but as if it had opened automatically in response to her presence. She walked through and I heard the door close behind her with a heavy metallic sound that suggested serious security hardware. I waited for about 10 minutes, hoping she might come back out, but nothing happened. The corridor was completely silent except for the distant rumble of train traffic. Eventually, I gave up and made my way back to the main station level, arriving at work almost an hour late with no good explanation for where I'd been. But that weekend, I researched the layout of Central Station more thoroughly. According to the official maps and documentation I could find online, there were extensive maintenance tunnels and service corridors throughout the underground complex, some connected to the actual subway tunnels, providing access for repair crews and emergency personnel. What I found most interesting was a reference to legacy infrastructure, parts of the original subway system that had been built in the 1940s and 50s, but were no longer in active use. These areas were maintained for safety reasons but weren't part of the current passenger or service operations. The door she'd gone through led to that legacy system. This past Monday, she was back on the train as if nothing had happened. Same spot, same posture, same unblinking stare. But when I got on at my usual station, I realized she had positioned herself directly across from my seat, instead of in her normal location near the back doors. For the entire ride, whenever I looked up from my phone, she was watching me. Not the distant, unfocused stare I'd observed before, but direct eye contact that felt intentional and aware. She knew I'd followed her. She knew I'd been studying her. And now she was studying me back. The eye contact was deeply unsettling because her expression never changed, but her attention was unmistakably focused on me. When other passengers got on or off, when the train stopped or started, when announcements played over the intercom, none of it affected her concentration. She just watched me with those unblinking eyes, as if I'd become the fixed point that previously hadn't existed. Tuesday morning, she was in the same position, same behavior. Wednesday and Thursday too. Each day, the intensity of her attention seemed to increase, though her expression remained completely neutral. Yesterday morning, something new happened. About halfway through the usual route, she moved. For the first time in 2 months of observation, she changed position, walking slowly across the car to stand directly next to my seat. I looked up at her and she was staring down at me with that same unblinking gaze. Up close, I could see details that weren't visible from a distance. Her skin had an odd, waxy quality that looked almost artificial. Her clothes, while clean and well-fitted, had a strange uniformity of color that suggested they might not be made from normal fabric. And her eyes, which I'd thought were brown from a distance, were actually a color I couldn't identify. Not brown, not green, not blue, but something that seemed to shift between all three depending on the angle of light. She stood there for the rest of the ride, about 15 minutes, never moving, never blinking, just staring down at me while I tried to concentrate on my phone and pretend nothing unusual was happening. Other passengers seemed to not see her at all, even when they walked past the space where she was standing. When the train reached Central Station, she walked back to the doors and got off as usual. But as she stepped onto the platform, she turned back and looked at me through the window. For the first time since I'd been observing her, her expression changed, just slightly, just for a moment, but she smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who had just figured out the solution to a problem they'd been working on for a long time. This morning, I seriously considered taking a different train or calling in sick to avoid seeing her. But I realized that changing my routine wouldn't solve anything. She knew who I was now, knew my schedule, knew that I'd been watching her. Avoiding the train would just mean postponing whatever was going to happen next. So I took the 7:15 as usual. She was there in her new position directly across from my seat, watching me with that unblinking stare, but today there was something different about the quality of her attention. Less observational, more anticipatory. And when I got off at my stop, she got off too. She followed me up the stairs, through the turnstiles onto the street. Always maintaining the same distance, always keeping me in sight, but never approaching directly. When I reached my office building, she stopped across the street and just stood there, watching. She's still there now. I can see her from my window, standing perfectly still on the sidewalk, staring up at the building. She's been there for 6 hours without moving, without blinking, without showing any sign of fatigue or discomfort. I don't know what she wants from me, or what I did by following her that day that changed our dynamic. But I understand now that my curiosity about her was a mistake. Whatever she is, wherever she comes from, she was content to be a passive observer until I made myself part of her pattern. Now I'm part of whatever she's doing, whatever purpose brings her onto that train every morning and sends her back into the tunnels where passengers aren't supposed to go. And I have the terrible feeling that tomorrow morning, when I take the 7:15 train, I'm going to find out exactly what that purpose is. Story 7. I heard my name announced over the intercom. The intercom crackled to life as we rolled through the tunnel between stations, and the automated voice made an announcement I'll never forget. "This is a courtesy announcement for passenger Michael Torrance. Please exit at the next station." That's my full name. My complete legal name that's not printed on any ticket or transit card. I looked around the car. Nobody else reacted like they hadn't heard it at all. My actual stop was still 4 stations away. When we pulled into the platform and the doors opened, I sat frozen in my seat, and that's when the voice came back. "Final warning for Michael Torrance." Let me back up and explain the context, because this happened on what should have been a perfectly ordinary Thursday night. I'd been at a concert at the Beacon Theater, nothing exotic, just a folk singer I'd been wanting to see for months. The show ended around 10:30, and I caught the subway heading back to Queens, where I live in a small apartment near Astoria Park. I'm a freelance graphic designer, which means I keep irregular hours and often find myself traveling around the city at times when most people are home watching television. The late-night subway crowd had become familiar to me over the past few years: hospital workers, restaurant staff, the occasional night owl like myself heading home from cultural events. The train was moderately full when I got on at 72nd Street, maybe 15 or 20 people scattered throughout the car. Normal mix of passengers, a few people in scrubs who looked like they were ending shifts, someone reading a paperback book under the fluorescent lights, a couple of college-age kids quietly sharing earbuds and listening to music. I found a seat near the middle of the car and settled in for the familiar 40-minute ride home. The concert had been excellent, intimate venue, great acoustics, the kind of performance that leaves you feeling energized and contemplative at the same time. I was scrolling through photos on my phone, including a few I'd taken of the stage, when the first announcement came. Transit system announcements are so common that most passengers tune them out automatically. Service delays, safety reminders, stations approaching. They become background noise that you process without conscious attention. But this announcement was different enough to cut through my post-concert reverie. "This is a courtesy announcement for passenger Michael Torrance. Please exit at the next station." The voice was the same computerized female tone used for all MTA announcements, with that slightly artificial cadence that sounds almost human but not quite. What made me look up from my phone wasn't the tone, it was the content. Michael Torrance is my full legal name, but Michael Torrance exactly as it appears on my driver's license and credit cards. And I knew with absolute certainty that I hadn't provided that information to anyone associated with the transit system. My Metro card was anonymous, paid for with cash. My monthly pass was registered under a different name for privacy reasons. There was no official record connecting my real identity to my subway usage. I looked around the car to see if other passengers had reacted to the announcement. Nobody seemed to have heard anything unusual. The person reading continued reading. The college kids kept listening to their music. A man in a business suit who'd been dozing against the window didn't even stir. My first thought was that I'd misheard the announcement, or that my name was similar enough to something else that my brain had filled in the blanks incorrectly. Michael Torrance isn't exactly a unique combination of names. There had to be dozens of Michael Torrances in the New York area, and maybe one of them had some reason to be contacted through the subway system. But as I replayed the announcement in my mind, I became more certain that I'd heard it correctly. The pronunciation had been precise, with the emphasis on the second syllable of Torrance that people always get wrong when they read my name for the first time. Whoever or whatever had generated that announcement knew exactly how my name was supposed to sound. The train was approaching 59th Street, Columbus Circle. According to the announcement, this was where I was supposed to get off, but it made no sense. My destination was still 4 stops away, and I had no reason to exit early. I stayed in my seat as the train pulled into the station, watching through the windows as a few passengers got off and a few others got on. The doors closed and we continued toward my actual stop. I tried to convince myself that I'd experienced some kind of auditory hallucination brought on by fatigue or the sensory overload of the concert. But as we pulled away from Columbus Circle and entered the tunnel toward the next station, the intercom crackled again. "Final warning for Michael Torrance." This time the computerized voice had a different quality. Still the same artificial female tone, but with an underlying urgency that hadn't been present in the first announcement. And the phrasing was more ominous. "Forfeit your right to leave" implied consequences that went beyond missing my stop or violating some transit regulation. I looked around the car again, more frantically this time, hoping to catch some sign that other passengers had heard the announcement. But their behavior remained unchanged. If anything, they seemed to be paying less attention to their surroundings than before, as if they'd become more deeply absorbed in their books, their music, their personal thoughts. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. None of them were moving naturally anymore. The person reading was turning pages at exactly regular intervals, regardless of how much text was on each page. The college kids sharing earbuds were nodding their heads to a rhythm that didn't vary. The businessman's breathing was too steady, too measured for someone who was actually asleep. They looked like people, but their behavior had become mechanical, as if they were performing the actions of subway passengers rather than actually being subway passengers. The train approached 42nd Street Port Authority, and I made a split-second decision to get off. Whatever was happening, I wanted to be around more people, in a larger, more public space where I could think clearly and figure out my next move. Port Authority is always crowded, always active, a place where unusual behavior would be noticed and responded to. But as the train slowed and I stood up to move toward the doors, I found I couldn't walk forward. Not paralysis exactly, but a resistance that felt like moving through thick liquid. Each step required enormous effort, and the distance to the doors seemed to be increasing even as I struggled toward them. The other passengers turned to look at me for the first time since the announcements had started. Their faces were blank, expressions completely neutral, but their eyes followed my movements with predatory attention. The person who'd been reading lowered their book, and I saw that the pages were blank. The college kids removed their earbuds, revealing that no wires connected them to any device. The businessman opened his eyes and smiled at me. His teeth were too white, too perfectly arranged, like a dental advertisement rather than actual human dentition. The doors opened at Port Authority, but I was still struggling to reach them against the invisible resistance that seemed to be holding me back. Through the windows, I could see the platform crowded with normal people. Tourists with luggage, commuters transferring between lines, vendors selling newspapers and snacks. But as I watched, those normal people began to fade, becoming translucent and then disappearing entirely, until the platform was completely empty. The sounds of Port Authority, announcements, conversations, the rumble of other trains, gradually diminished to silence. The doors closed and the train continued deeper into the tunnel system. "Thank you for your cooperation, Michael Torrance," the intercom announced. I collapsed back into my seat, no longer able to maintain the effort of trying to reach the doors. The other passengers returned their attention to their props. The blank book, the disconnected earbuds, the simulation of sleep. But I could feel them monitoring me with peripheral awareness, ready to react if I made another attempt to leave. The train continued through stations I recognized: 34th Street, Herald Square, 14th Street, Union Square, Spring Street, but we didn't stop at any of them. Through the windows, I could see the platforms were all empty, the stations lit but devoid of any human presence. We were traveling through a version of the subway system that existed parallel to the real one, using the same tracks and tunnels but serving no passengers except me. At some point, the familiar stations ended and we entered territory I didn't recognize. The tunnel walls changed from modern concrete to older brickwork that looked like it dated from the original subway construction in the early 1900s. The lighting became dimmer and more sporadic, casting moving shadows that made it difficult to see clearly outside the windows. We stopped at a platform I'd never seen before. The sign read "Terminus" in the same font used throughout the subway system, but there were no maps, no service announcements, no indication of where this station fit into the larger transit network. "End of the line for Michael Torrance," the intercom announced. "Please gather your belongings and exit the train." The other passengers stood up in perfect unison and began filing toward the doors. As they passed my seat, each one looked at me directly and smiled that same artificial smile, revealing teeth that were too perfect to be human. The doors opened and they exited onto the platform. I could see them through the windows, standing in a neat line facing the train, waiting for something. I remained in my seat, terrified of what would happen if I got off, but equally afraid of what might occur if I refused to comply with the instructions. The intercom crackled once more. "Failure to exit will result in permanent assignment to this route. You will become part of the regular service, assisting other passengers who require special transportation." I understood then that the other passengers, the people I thought were fellow travelers, had once been in my situation. They'd heard their names announced, failed to exit when instructed, and become part of whatever system was operating this phantom version of the subway. They were still standing on the platform, still smiling, still waiting. But now I could see that their clothes were from different eras. 1980s business attire, 1990s casual wear, early 2000s fashion. They'd been collected over decades, added to the roster of fake passengers used to maintain the illusion of normal transit service for whoever came next. I got off the train. The platform was smaller than it had appeared through the windows, with walls that curved inward like we were inside a large pipe rather than a constructed station. There were no exits visible, no stairs or escalators leading to street level, just the platform itself surrounded by tunnels that disappeared into darkness. The other passengers formed a circle around me, still smiling, still silent. The train doors closed behind me, and I heard it pull away into the tunnel. Though when I turned to look, there was nothing there, just empty tracks extending into blackness. One of the passengers, a woman in 1990s business attire, stepped forward and handed me a small card. "Welcome to the team," she said, her voice carrying the same artificial quality as the intercom announcements. "Your training will begin shortly." She pointed toward one of the tunnels where I could now see a faint light indicating some kind of passage or chamber. The other passengers began walking in that direction, moving with the same mechanical precision I'd observed on the train. I followed them because there was no other choice. The tunnel led to a large underground space filled with identical subway cars arranged in neat rows like a depot or maintenance facility. But these cars were all empty, all waiting, all part of the same system that had collected me and the others. In the center of the space was a control room with windows overlooking the entire facility. Inside, I could see figures in transit authority uniforms monitoring banks of screens and control panels. They looked more human than the passengers, but there was something wrong with their proportions, too tall, too thin, with movements that were just slightly off. The woman in business attire handed me a uniform identical to the ones worn by the figures in the control room. "Your shift begins now," she said. "You'll be assigned to train 7739, serving the Michael Torrance route." I understood then that I was going to become part of the system that had trapped me. I would wear the uniform, monitor the controls, and help operate the trains that collected other people who'd somehow attracted the attention of whatever entity ran this parallel transit network. But I also understood something else. The system needed cooperation to function effectively. The artificial passengers, the fake announcements, the simulated normalcy. It was all designed to make people comply willingly with instructions they didn't understand. And if cooperation was necessary, then resistance might be possible. I put on the uniform but began looking for ways to disrupt the process. Over what felt like weeks or months, time moved strangely in that underground facility. I learned the routines, memorized the procedures, and identified weaknesses in the system. The control room operators were powerful but not infallible. They relied on automated processes and predictable human behavior. They expected their collected passengers to follow instructions, to accept their new roles, to become part of the machinery without question. But they didn't expect sabotage from within. I started small, subtle changes to announcement scripts that would alert real passengers to the danger. Modifications to route schedules that would disrupt the collection process. Technical malfunctions that would prevent the phantom trains from reaching their destinations. Each act of resistance made the system less efficient, less capable of maintaining its illusion of normal transit service. And eventually I found a way to reverse the process entirely. The same technology that transported people from the real subway system to this underground facility could work in the opposite direction. By accessing the right controls at the right time, I could send myself back to the surface, back to the world where trains ran on published schedules and passengers exited at stations that existed on official maps. But I couldn't leave without warning others about what was happening beneath the city. So I'm telling you this story from a computer terminal in that underground facility, uploading it to every platform I can access before making my escape attempt. If you ever hear your name announced over the subway intercom, if you're instructed to exit at a station that isn't your destination, don't comply. Stay on the train, get off at your planned stop, and report the incident to transit authorities immediately. Because somewhere beneath the regular subway system, there's another network entirely. One that collects passengers who fit certain profiles, who attract attention for reasons I still don't fully understand, who disappear into a parallel transit system that serves purposes no human institution would approve. And if you don't resist when they call your name, you'll become part of their regular service, helping them collect the next person who makes the mistake of listening when the intercom speaks directly to them. I'm about to attempt my return to the surface. If this message reaches you, it means I succeeded in escaping. But it also means the system is still operating, still collecting passengers, still waiting for the next person whose name they've somehow learned. Don't let that person be you. Story 8. The last train doesn't go where you think. I'm a photographer. And I spend more time on the subway at 3 a.m. than most people spend on it in a month. So when I tell you something is wrong with the last train on the blue line, you need to believe me. It starts normal. Same route, same announcements, same tired faces heading home. But somewhere after Riverside Station, the train doesn't surface like it should. It stays underground, and the stops that follow aren't on any map. If you ride it all the way to the end, you'll step onto a platform that predates the entire subway system. I know because I got off there. I took pictures, and when I finally made it back 3 days later, my camera was full of photos I don't remember taking. In every single one, I'm standing on that platform, but I'm not alone. Let me establish my credentials before I tell you what I discovered, because what I'm about to share sounds impossible until you understand how thoroughly I know the subway system. I'm Marcus Chen, and I've been a freelance photographer in this city for 8 years. My specialty is urban documentation. the spaces and moments that most people pass through without really seeing. Night photography is my passion, and the subway after midnight offers unlimited subject matter. Empty platforms with dramatic lighting, the interplay of shadows and artificial illumination, the occasional late shift worker or insomniac creating human interest in otherwise industrial spaces. I've probably spent more time underground between 2 and 5 a.m. than most transit employees. I know every station on every line. I know which platforms have the best sight lines, which tunnels create interesting acoustic effects, which maintenance areas are accessible for the kind of atmospheric shots that define my portfolio. I've documented abandoned stations, construction zones, and infrastructure that most passengers never realize exists beneath their feet. The Blue Line has always been one of my favorite subjects because it covers such diverse geography and architectural styles. It starts in the financial district with those gorgeous Art Deco stations from the 1930s, runs through Midtown with its utilitarian 1960s aesthetic, then heads out to the suburbs where the above-ground sections offer completely different photographic opportunities. The last train of the night departs downtown at 2:47 a.m. and reaches the end of the line in Riverside at 3:52 a.m. I've ridden it dozens of times, usually with camera equipment, documenting the transition from urban density to suburban sprawl that happens over the course of that 65-minute journey. 3 weeks ago, I decided to do a comprehensive photo essay on that final run, the last train carrying the city's insomniacs, night workers, and various characters who populate public transportation after the normal world goes to sleep. I'd ridden portions of the route before, but never the complete end-to-end journey with the specific intention of documenting every station, every passenger, every moment of that transition from city to suburb. I boarded at Central Station with my usual equipment: 2 camera bodies, various lenses, a portable flash unit, and backup batteries for what I expected to be a long night of shooting. The train was moderately full, maybe 25 passengers scattered throughout several cars, which was typical for that time of night. For the first 40 minutes, everything proceeded normally. I got some excellent shots of late-night commuters, the changing light quality as we moved from underground to elevated sections, the progression of station architecture that told the story of the subway system's evolution over decades. The passengers were exactly what I expected: hospital workers ending shifts, restaurant staff heading home after closing, a few people who'd obviously been out drinking and were now dealing with the consequences of staying out too late. Everyone looked tired but familiar, the kind of urban night owls I'd been photographing for years. We made our scheduled stops: Financial District, Union Square, Columbus Circle, all the way out through the residential neighborhoods that marked the outer reaches of the subway's coverage. Normal announcements, normal timing, normal everything. But somewhere after Riverside, which should have been the final stop, the train didn't terminate. Instead of the usual end of the line, all passengers must exit announcement, we simply continued into what I assumed must be a maintenance yard or storage facility. I wasn't immediately concerned. Sometimes trains run past their final passenger stop to reach maintenance areas, and passengers are occasionally carried along for the ride if they don't exit promptly. I figured we'd sit in a yard for a few minutes while the conductor completed whatever post-service procedures were necessary, then return to Riverside where I could catch a bus or ride-share home. But instead of entering a maintenance facility, we continued through tunnels that I'd never seen before. Not the familiar concrete and steel infrastructure of the modern subway system, but older construction, brick archways and stonework that looked like it predated the subway by decades. The lighting changed too. Instead of the standard fluorescent fixtures, we were passing through sections illuminated by what looked like gas lamps or very old electrical installations. The effect was atmospheric in a way that would have been perfect for photography. but I was becoming too unsettled to focus on composition and lighting. I moved through the train looking for other passengers who might be able to explain what was happening, but the car was now completely empty except for me. Everyone who'd been aboard for the regular journey had apparently gotten off at Riverside, leaving me as the sole passenger continuing into this unknown territory. I tried to signal the conductor, but there was no response from the front of the train. I pressed the emergency call button but got only static. My phone showed no signal and couldn't determine our location. According to GPS, we were nowhere. The train stopped at a platform that definitely wasn't on any official map. The station was enormous, with vaulted ceilings that disappeared into darkness above the reach of the platform lighting. The architecture was unlike anything in the current subway system. Ornate stonework, decorative ironwork, design elements that belonged to the late 1800s rather than mid-20th century transit construction. The sign read Central Terminus, in elaborate serif lettering that looked hand-painted rather than mass-produced. There were no modern amenities, no digital displays, no automated announcements, no accessibility features required by contemporary building codes. And there were people on the platform, dozens of them, all dressed in clothing from different historical periods. Victorian-era dresses and suits, 1920s fashion, 1940s military uniforms, clothing from every decade stretching back over a century. They were all waiting, presumably for trains, but their behavior was wrong. They stood too still, faced the wrong directions, and showed no reaction when our train arrived. Most unsettling, they all appeared to be photographing something, holding cameras from their respective time periods, old box cameras, medium format devices, even some early digital equipment from the 1990s. But they weren't photographing the train or each other. They were all pointing their cameras at empty space, clicking shutters at regular intervals, as if documenting something invisible to me. The train doors opened with their familiar hiss, but the sound echoed strangely in the cavernous station, creating reverberations that suggested the space was much larger than what I could see. I sat frozen in my seat, torn between curiosity and an instinctive understanding that getting off the train would be a mistake. But my photographer's instincts overrode my survival instincts. This was the most extraordinary scene I'd ever encountered, and I had professional-grade equipment with me. Whatever was happening here, I needed to document it. I stepped onto the platform. The air was different, thicker, with a metallic taste that reminded me of old coins or blood. The temperature was cooler than it should have been for an underground space, and there was a constant low-frequency hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The people on the platform didn't acknowledge my presence, but as I began taking photographs, they gradually turned their attention toward me. Not hostile, but intensely curious, as if I was the most interesting thing they'd seen in a very long time. I shot everything. The station architecture, the anachronistic passengers, the empty train tracks that extended into tunnels darker than any I'd seen in the regular subway system. My camera's flash illuminated details that weren't visible under the ambient lighting. Carved symbols in the stonework, text in languages I didn't recognize, structural elements that seemed to serve no practical purpose. But the most disturbing discovery came when I reviewed the images on my camera's LCD screen. In every photo that included the platform passengers, there were additional figures that I hadn't seen with my naked eyes. Translucent people in modern clothing, standing among the historical figures, all holding contemporary cameras and phones. And in several images I could see myself, not as the photographer, but as another subject in the scene. Multiple versions of myself, dressed in different clothing, holding different cameras, as if I'd been visiting this platform repeatedly over a long period of time. I don't remember taking those photos. I remember shooting the station, the architecture, the strange passengers. But according to my camera's memory, I'd also documented myself from angles that would have been impossible given my position and equipment. That's when I realized I needed to leave immediately. I ran back toward the train, but the doors had closed and it was pulling away into the darkness. The platform passengers watched me with what might have been sympathy, still clicking their cameras at regular intervals, still documenting whatever invisible phenomena had brought them to this underground terminus. I looked for exits, stairs, escalators, any way to reach street level, but the only passages led deeper into the station complex, through archways that opened onto corridors extending beyond the reach of any light source. I had no choice but to explore. The passages formed a maze of interconnected tunnels and chambers, all built with the same ornate stonework as the main platform. Some areas were lit by gas flames that burned without any visible fuel source. Others were illuminated by early electric bulbs that cast yellow, flickering light that created moving shadows on every surface. In the chambers branching off from the main corridors, I found evidence of long-term habitation. Sleeping areas furnished with beds from different historical periods, kitchens equipped with appliances spanning over a century of technology, libraries containing books in dozens of languages and time periods, and photographs, thousands upon thousands of photographs covering every available wall surface. Images of the platform, the tunnels, the various chambers, but always featuring people I didn't recognize, dressed in clothing from different eras, all holding cameras of their own. The photos were organized chronologically, starting with daguerreotypes from the 1850s and progressing through every photographic technology up to high-resolution digital images that looked like they'd been taken yesterday. But the subjects were always the same. Photographers documenting other photographers in an endless recursive loop of image making. At the end of one corridor, I found a chamber that was obviously meant for me. My name was written above the entrance in the same elaborate script used for the station signage. Inside was a bed, a desk, developing equipment for both film and digital photography, and walls prepared for displaying images. On the desk was a note in handwriting I recognized as my own, though I had no memory of writing it. "Welcome back, Marcus. You've been documenting this place for longer than you remember." I reviewed my camera's memory more carefully and found hundreds of images I hadn't taken, spanning what appeared to be months or years of photography in this underground complex. Images of chambers I'd never seen, people I'd never met, events I'd never witnessed. But in every photo there was evidence of my presence, my shadow, my reflection, sometimes my face partially visible at the edge of the frame. According to the metadata, these images had been captured over the past 3 years during trips to this platform that I had no memory of making. But the most disturbing photos were the ones showing me sleeping in the chamber that had been prepared for me, apparently documenting myself during periods of unconsciousness in this underground space. I don't know how long I spent exploring the station complex. Time moved differently there, and my phone's clock displayed random numbers that changed without any logical pattern. But eventually I found a service tunnel that led upward toward what I hoped was street level. The climb took hours. The tunnel was steep, poorly lit, and filled with obstacles that seemed designed to prevent people from leaving. But I was motivated by the growing certainty that staying in the station would mean joining the ranks of historical photographers who'd never found their way back to the surface. I emerged through a maintenance hatch in Central Park at what my phone indicated was 4:30 a.m. on a Tuesday. But when I checked the date, 3 days had passed since I'd boarded the last train on the Blue Line. 3 days that I had no memory of, spent in an underground facility that didn't appear on any transit map. The photos on my camera told the story I couldn't remember. 3 days of systematic documentation. 3 days of living in that prepared chamber. 3 days of being part of whatever project required photographers to document each other in an endless cycle of image making. But the most unsettling discovery came when I had the images professionally developed and printed. In every photo taken during those 3 days, there was a figure standing beside me. Someone wearing my clothes, holding my backup camera, photographing the same subjects from slightly different angles. My doppelganger, my replacement. The version of me that had been visiting that platform for 3 years, building a body of work I'd never seen, living a parallel life in spaces I'd never consciously explored. And in the final image on my camera's memory card, both versions of me are looking directly into the lens, as if we're both aware we're being photographed by someone else entirely. I haven't taken the blue line since that night. I've switched to different routes, different schedules, different methods of getting around the city. But sometimes when I'm developing film in my darkroom, I find images I don't remember taking. Always the same subject, the central terminus platform with its historical passengers and their endless documentation project. And sometimes, very late at night, I receive text messages from my own phone number. Just coordinates and timestamps indicating when the last train departs and where it's really going. Because I understand now that there are 2 versions of every subway line. The official routes that carry regular passengers to mapped destinations, and the shadow routes that serve different purposes entirely. Routes that collect people like me. Documentarians, observers, anyone whose job involves seeing things others miss. The central terminus is a repository for visual memory, a place where every moment that's ever been photographed or filmed continues to exist in some form, and it needs photographers to maintain that archive, to continue documenting the endless stream of images that flow through its halls. I was chosen for that project years before I was consciously aware of it, selected and trained and gradually integrated into a system that operates parallel to the world everyone else inhabits. But the selection process isn't finished. Every night, the last train on every line picks up passengers who fit the profile. Artists, journalists, anyone whose work involves documenting reality. Most of them return to the surface with no memory of where they've been, carrying back only the subconscious knowledge that they've been part of something larger than themselves. But some, like me, remember enough to be useful. We become bridges between the surface world and the archive, gathering images and information that feed the endless project of documenting everything that happens in the city above. And if you're reading this, if you work with cameras or computers or any form of image capture, if you've ever felt compelled to document the hidden spaces of the city, then you've probably already been selected. Check your phone. Look for messages from numbers you don't recognize, coordinates that point to subway stations you've never visited, timestamps that don't match your conscious schedule. Because the last train on every line goes to the same place eventually. And once you've been there, once you've seen the central terminus and understood what it contains, you become part of the project whether you remember it or not. I'm going back tonight. Not because I have to, but because I want to. Because I've seen what we're building down there, and it's more important than anything happening on the surface. We're creating a permanent record of human consciousness, one photograph at a time. Every image ever captured, every moment ever preserved, archived and maintained in spaces that exist outside normal time and geography. And if you take the last train tonight, if you ride it past the final stop on the official map, you'll see it too. You'll understand why some of us choose to spend our nights underground, documenting the endless flow of images that define what it means to be human in a world where everything is recorded, everything is preserved, everything is remembered. The camera never lies, but it doesn't always tell you the whole truth about what you've seen, where you've been, or who you've become in the process of seeing. Take the last train. Find out what you've been photographing all along.